So thanks so much for having this quick chat with me, Nora. We are talking today about Clause 2C of the BELA Bill. And I'm just going to briefly say, when I first looked at that clause, it bothered me that it could be used sort of to attack one's political opponents by stopping them from doing a service delivery protest was even mentioned. Sort of using the fact that they interrupt or, get in the way of school, even if they're non-violent and comply in every other way. Learners have also got a right to join those protests too. And then I realized that in addition to that, it can also criminalize parents for shutting down schools or protesting on school grounds, which in the last year or two has been around issues like not being able to stop persistent severe corporal punishment, not being able to solve severe overcrowding, like over 100 kids in a class, things like that, and also problems with severely dangerous infrastructure. Sometimes parents have said it's too dangerous for our kids to enter this building. And the example that was given to me at the pre-hearing workshops was a man who said that in his school, they had begged for chairs and done so for a very long time with lots of communication, and that the chairs never arrived until they shut the school down for the day. Then the chairs arrived. So this is often the last resort for people. And all of that can be covered by Clause 2C. But then there's another possibility as well, which sounds crazy to South Africans. Sounds impossible. I mean, crazy is not the right word, but it sounds impossible and until you realize that it's actually been done in the US. So, having that vague wording there that I want to look at in a minute, I don't know if you can just tell us very briefly, is this a thing in the US that kids actually get arrested rather than sent to detention?
Yes, for sure. So an issue in the US right now is the school to prison pipeline and the criminalization of pretty normal adolescent or young child behavior in a classroom setting, and kind of the involvement of police in schools right now is something that in a lot of places throughout the US people are protesting against, and there's a lot of movements, especially like youth-led movements in the US, trying to get police officers and policing and criminalization out of US schools at the moment. Because that phenomenon is definitely something that is really harmful to children in the US, and it definitely specifically affects children of color for the most part as well. It's definitely disproportionately applied throughout the US. And currently, I mean, the US has a major issue in terms of its prison system in general. Like, it's one of the largest, I believe, the largest population incarcerated per capita in the if not the highest, it's very close to the highest. It's definitely very high compared to most places, and children are a part of that population that is incarcerated in the US. Some as young as, I work with some children who are incarcerated in Montana, and some are as young as 11 years old.
Wow, 11. I think our criminal capacity in South Africa is 14, but I'm not a lawyer, and this recording is not legal advice. But yeah, even if it was just learners who were adults, we have a number in the public school system over 18 and over. It's especially since the pandemic, we've got 20-year-olds in there. Now, one of the things that I saw is that when I had a little bit of a look at the US situation, there's no indication that this increases the safety in schools, for example. In fact, maybe quite the opposite, especially from a learner's perspective. And I think one of the things that might possibly be behind this in South Africa is that there is a rising level of learner violence in schools, and a couple of teachers have been killed because the situation is so horrific. But to my mind, if the situation is so horrific, you fix the situation. You regulate ratios of teacher to students and overcrowding and all of these things. You solve that rather than starting to criminalize children. Because also one of the things that I also noticed looking at the US is that it's, yes, definitely, obviously students of color in the US, because they are very marginalized and there's an enormous amount of systemic racism there, but also neurodivergent learners. And when that intersection comes together, one of the problems we've got in South Africa is there's an enormous number of undiagnosed neurodivergent learners who are going to have a harder time firstly getting to school, so their parents are more likely to be criminalized for their non-attendance. On the other hand, when they are forced to attend under those conditions, just the sensory overload is going to create meltdowns and other things that could then be interpreted as severe disruptions and criminalized. And that really worries me as well.
For sure. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that that is something that is also occurring in the US, that as well learners that are neurodivergent are kind of facing some of the most severe repercussions of criminalization of behaviors in schools. And yeah, often students who are actually in need of some sort of support. And often as well, when students are experiencing some sort of mental health crisis as well, there's a reliance in a lot of US schools to then, yeah, bring in police officers and bring in, have them bring in guns and intimidation tactics and really actually escalate the situation quite severely, when in fact the situation could have been de-escalated by more support for the learners and perhaps, yeah, more mental health resources versus criminal resources.
This is also what worries me, because when teachers are begging for what can we do instead of corporal punishment, which I've heard a number of times during the process of this BELA Bill public hearings process over a couple of years, it means that the positive discipline training they're supposed to receive, which should also include things like how to support a learner who's having a crisis, and to some extent at least the beginnings of how to know when to refer somebody for support, that's not happening. And that this is a much easier thing for the department to do, is to make it possible to call the cops. And I think that there's probably a lot of teachers who welcome being able to call the cops. Now, obviously, we're not going to easily get away with that in your well-resourced school where it's not a big problem in the first place. But I almost wonder if it's a way to reduce the overcrowding. I don't know. It's just the whole prospect is so horrible. I'm horrified that it's possible. I want to quickly just actually share the clause, because I want to just also show, why I see this as really being a thing, because some people have said to me, but any other person obviously needs an adult. But it was the any person in the US that did the job, because this wasn't originally in the US a law against kids. This was originally in the US a law against adults coming onto campus, but they just worded it vaguely. And then when the civil rights movement got going, it started getting turned against kids in environments where they could get away with turning it against kids. And then it became, an established thing that's now hard to undo. So it blows my mind that they have written this, any person who, and there's two sentences here as well, any person who unlawfully and intentionally interrupts. Now you see that might have given learners a bit of grace, because you'd have to prove that it was unlawful and intentional interruption. But then they add in this second sentence that for me doesn't make a lot of sense in any other way. And I was kind of hoping James Ndlebe would give me a different explanation for this, but he didn't. So there's this extra sentence, which is kind of a redundancy, which then makes it any person who disturbs or hinders any official educational activity of a school. Now, any person who disturbs or hinders hinders or obstructs any school in the performance of the school's official duties. That doesn't have to be unlawful or intentional. You just have to disturb or hinder. And then I kind of wonder, how far can that go? Because this is one of the criticisms of the US laws, is that they allow for a very wide range of interpretations, depending on how much power that particular learner in their particular community has, and sort of the discretion of the local judiciary, who may be corrupt in South Africa, honestly, sometimes, hopefully not, but it happens. That there's kind of just so much margin there. I mean, what do you have to do to hinder the activity of the classroom? Not very much. And that's what really worries me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I
So
think that discretion can definitely be abused, and I know has been in certain cases in the US. Like I know of examples of, for example, like a teenager being on their cell phone and then the teacher asking them to give their cell phone over to them, and them not complying quickly enough, and then police being called in and escalating the situation. So things as minor as that, that are clearly not like dangerous or unsafe behaviors, but are just within the realm of typical behaviors for young people, then being criminalized and escalated in a very dramatic fashion. And again,
yeah,
like you said, really depending on as well, like kind of the power that particular learner holds, and how different identities definitely can be targeted to different extents with that
yeah,
discretion.
yeah. And that could get very, very interesting in South Africa, because I think in the US things are a little more clear cut in terms of sort of who has power and who doesn't. Whereas in South Africa, it's a shifting landscape. We don't know what's going to happen in the elections. We don't know what's going to happen in the next elections. The law stands for a long time. And I think things also have a tendency to, we get that Overton window of what's acceptable that shifts, where people go, oh, but this is beyond the pale, but this is normal. And as that thing shifts and shifts and shifts, it can really go down and down and down. So you might start with a situation where the first arrest under this looks pretty reasonable, and then the next one shifts a little bit further, and the next one a little bit further, and over a number of years in certain communities we could really get to some very opportunistic arrests just because people don't particularly like that kid, for example, or their mother's a bit difficult on the school board, or who knows. The one other thing that really worries me is under apartheid, we had a system where prisoners were hired out in a way that actually brought down human rights condemnations of kind of a sort of state slavery, and that was done away with. And I was extremely disturbed when investigating now, would they really jail the kids or would they not? I mean, obviously, there's no way to know, and this is the scary thing. There's no way to know. But I was very disturbed to see the phrase in the correctional services page that there's a plan to help with the revenue problems by hiring out labor. Now, they already do labor to make the prison sustainable, growing cabbages and sewing uniforms and things like that. But hiring out the labor as a source of revenue, that just kind of made me think, well, if I, as an average citizen business person, not part of that system, wanted to hire prison labor because it's cost effective for me, am I going to prefer an actual criminal who I have to kind of watch my back? Or am I going to prefer a nice, healthy 18-year-old who's young and fit and strong, and all he was doing was maybe texting his girlfriend in a breakup crisis, and therefore he was emotionally charged about stopping and ended up in the prison system? But when I hear his story, I'm going to go, oh, poor kid, I'd rather hire him and I feel safer. So that kind of made me really get my hackles up in terms of, wow, especially if you look at your really, really disadvantaged areas like the Eastern Cape, where there's a lot of people of, demographics that tend to really already get very, very marginalized, and where there is terrible overcrowding, and where there is, sort of more justification for arrests in the classroom because we do sometimes see violence there. It really does worry me that could also then be seen as sort of an opportunity to make some money. That scares me. Even if, as I said, even if we talk about only kids who are 18 and above, there's still a very real problem there. I don't see how we need anything in clause 2C that is in clause 2C, because either you're committing a crime or you shouldn't be arrested. the moment that we need any of those things in clause 2C, we're saying, although people aren't really committing a crime, we're making it a crime to be inconvenient to a school. And I think that's really pushing it. Why? Why a school? Why not criminalize anybody who disturbs a library or a place of healing, or are we going to criminalize people who have a freak out in the hospital because their person's just passed away or something like that? We're going to criminalize them too. What's so special about a school? It's not a life or death matter in a school classroom if somebody's a little disruptive. It could be in the hospital. So I'm just really finding that clause 2C very, very problematic, no matter which way you look at it. And it bothers me that we've got a DBE that thinks that that clause is acceptable, appropriate, useful, and the fact that they didn't do what some of the US amendments are doing and just simply insert who isn't a student. It would have still been bad enough because you could still use it to arrest the parents, you could still use it to arrest the protesters, but they could have just inserted that any person who is not a student, as in the US. That would have been a very easy thing to do, and I've got no answer as to why they didn't do it. So that's where things are at for me. I don't know if you have any final words, but I think I've said everything that I need to say that's on my mind right now.
No, I think I've said it all as well, and yeah. Thank you for chatting with me about it, Jana.
Yeah, I really appreciate you weighing in on this, because I think it's hard for South Africans. It was hard for me to imagine that this could be a reality, because it's so far removed from where we are and what we know. And I think it's just important that we do look at how much influence has been coming from the US into the DBE in the last couple of years, and to just catch a wake up that this is not an impossibility. So thank you very, very much, and safe travels.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope to chat to you soon about happier things. Because it would be really great to get all of this behind us and actually start focusing again on how to build the positive stuff, and sort of help make the education landscape in South Africa a more beautiful place. I would really like to get back to that conversation. And it's, for me, a crying shame that the BELA doesn't actually support and get that conversation going in the way that it could. So thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.